Yeah, thank you for joining once again. The webinar of Attivo Keys to the Kingdom, hosted by Exclusive Networks. My name is Renee van der Griendt. I'm a business innovator at Exclusive Networks Netherlands, where I'm responsible for new vendors in our portfolio as for Attivo Networks. As most of you will know, Exclusive Networks is a value-add distributor with a broad portfolio in the field of security, networking, storage, and server, and cloud and DevOps solutions. In today's webinar, we will be focusing on one of our security vendors. They're distinctive in their threat detection by deception. Nick Palmer will later on present to you what Attivo Networks is all about, and will specify a map out, demonstrate their AD Assessor. A quick general note beforehand, please all put your microphones on mute. Questions can be asked in the chat, and we'll be handling those through and at the end of the webinar. Now, I would like to give the floor to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. I hope you can all hear me, and I hope you can see my screen okay.
Yes, we can.
Colleagues, thank you for joining today. As Renee mentioned, Attivo have an interesting and an unusual way to detect attackers resident in the network. But what I wanted to do was really to start with a little overview of why we are so focused on some of these critical assets. When we talk about attackers joining networks and seeking to compromise them, seeking to exfiltrate data, seeking to establish beachheads or trusted positions within networks, we know that they can do this very quickly. A good attacker can get into a network and gain visibility of Active Directory within half a day. Now, if you accept the fact that the attacker will also have an undetected time on that network, as we say, a dwell time of 40 or 50 days, I think you'll agree this is a long time for an attacker to be resident on a network with visibility of those critical assets. This is extra time for the attacker to understand the environment, figure out what's important, figure out what he can sell and what he can monetize, but most importantly, to stay undetected so that when he's completed his campaign, he can exit, and that's often the first you will know about it. The first you will know about it is when an agency comes knocking on the door reporting that your data is public. So it's with this in mind that we start with this notion of visibility. Visibility on the network with an Attivo solution really begins across three core assets. And when we're talking about attack activity, these crown jewel assets are normally from left to right here: Active Directory, cloud assets, and on-premise assets. Now, good attackers can make use of these crown jewel assets at any point in their campaign. Very often, very early in the campaign, Active Directory or cloud will be something of interest because these are often fairly easily visible to an attacker. But attackers are opportunistic and they are pragmatic. So whatever they can get access to, they will start to look for ways to compromise and look for ways to monetize those assets. So it's with this in mind that we begin our journey with visibility of those assets in terms of their configuration and in terms of the existing security posture. Now, why is this important? Well, within Active Directory, within cloud, within on-premise, there are certain misconfigurations, certain vulnerabilities, certain conditions that you really don't want an attacker to find on your network. If we imagine an endpoint, a workstation within the network, with a domain admin credential left on it by a domain admin who'd previously done some work on that machine represents an extremely serious threat vector to the organization, because if an attacker lands on that machine and looks in memory, he has a domain admin credential. This is as serious as things could possibly be, because when the attacker can then get residence on the domain controller, install software, establish persistence, start breaking out and using Kerberos vulnerabilities and cutting golden tickets, this really spells the end of the campaign from the perspective of the defending teams. Similarly, within AD itself, there are dozens of configuration options within Active Directory that are well publicized in attack toolkits and which an attacker could very easily use, could leverage to deliver value to him in support of a campaign. And so what we do with Attivo is we're looking really at not only assessing and hardening the environment, but also protecting and detecting attackers in production. This is really our 2-mile view. This is the very top level of what Attivo do. We're as much about visibility of configurations around permissions and privilege as we are about protecting and detecting attackers in production. So with that in mind, the solution we're under discussion today is AD Assessor. And we like to call this a continuous penetration test for Active Directory. Because what it's doing, and I will explain the architecture in some detail later, is it's really aiming to remove an attacker's ability to move laterally and to escalate privileges within the network. This is critically important because by the time an attacker has been able to move laterally, it could even be considered to be too late. As soon as they've moved off their initial landing point, they're very, very easy to lose, especially if they've been able to get admin credentials or go straight to a machine where they think the administrators are logged on. And so from that perspective, within the Attivo solution, and particularly around the AD Assessor solution, we're really about understanding vulnerabilities. This is really about hardening Active Directory and making sure there are no obvious and clear misconfigurations that an attacker could exploit. In the same way, we can do real-time detection on Active Directory. If you have active attacks on the network that are featuring Active Directory activity or featuring activity, for example, to brute force passwords or to attempt to establish persistence on the domain controllers, these are all things that can be supported with these solutions. Now, from an ROI perspective, this is something that we talk about a lot with customers because in order to properly assess a large domain infrastructure, including forests, including trust relationships, including all of the subdomains, this has typically been something that would take days or weeks to complete. And as we'll see later on, this is something that we can complete with automated tooling incredibly quickly, typically within the first day. And the final point here really is this idea of being able to understand what you can and can't change on the environment, because this vulnerability on exposures, you can deliver these in a single pane of glass, but sometimes, particularly within large infrastructure enabling systems like Active Directory, there are things that you can't change. You know, there are conditions like never expiring passwords for accounts that nobody would like to have in place, but you know, legacy configurations suggest that you need them. And so from that perspective, then you can mitigate against these risks, understand these risks, and move forward with them in place, but know the potential consequences of them. And all of this really bundled up to what this chap Heilman said, really about the attackers inside the network are interested in privilege, because it's with privilege that you can move across the network undetected. And from an undetected position, you can perform reconnaissance and then gain visibility of the information you're looking to access. Whatever that is, that could be critical customer information, it could be business plans, it could be merger and acquisition information, it could be customer databases, it could be medical records. All of these things are legitimate candidates for protection using Active Directory and using AD Assessor. So what we'll do is we'll start with a quick view on how attackers see Active Directory. Now, this is in support of me positioning the solution to you, but it's also, I think, potentially going to be useful if you guys are not used to positioning Active Directory solutions to your customers. And so from the perspective of an attacker within an environment, you guys will know from your existing security work, security practices, that there are lots of attack toolkits and lots of methods that an attacker can use to understand what's on a network and to understand how to move across the network. But by far the quickest and easiest way for an attacker to understand the vulnerabilities and the critical conditions on a network is by using attack tools against AD, because AD will tell him where the critical workloads live, where there are exploitation points, where there are strange permissions associated with groups, where there are scripts, for example, in sysvol or netlogon, where there are hashes or clear text passwords. So rather than running a credential scraper through memory, or rather than running a network detection tool and a network scanner and risk being discovered, this guy can compromise an endpoint and he can query Active Directory, and Active Directory will tell him everything he wants and it won't raise any alarms. And similarly, if you want to get into more detail about, for example, the domain admins, please, dear AD, here's an attack tool that is going to query you and tell me where all of the domain admins are currently logged on. Oh, look, 10.10.0.17 has an active session for a domain admin. If I get onto that machine and then use my memory scrapers, I've got a domain admin credential. And it's that simple. This is why attackers can do it as quickly as they can. But also there are things like service accounts. These are known quantities. These are very important parts of any organizational structure. Any management of IT assets requires these things. But what if they have privileges that they don't need? What if they've been moved to be in groups that have privileges elsewhere, or that can be used to access control lists that might govern their permissions? All of these things are things that you can very, very easily get from Active Directory as an attacker. And finally, because all organizations rely on Active Directory, because it's everywhere, even the non-Microsoft based organizations, the Linux based organizations will probably have some kind of LDAP based directory in place, possibly based on Microsoft schemas. So this becomes the single most valuable resource in a network early in an attack, because it doesn't alert when it's talked to, it gives real information to attackers, and there are huge numbers of attack toolkits that will sweat out Active Directory vulnerabilities. PowerShell Empire, Cobalt Strike, the new modules in Mimikatz, these have all got very, very strong links into an attack community which is focused solely on Active Directory. So the AD Assessor solution, now from a partner's perspective, this is one of the things where I've been doing these jobs, in terms of security and in terms of software technical selling for probably nearly 30 years now. And I have never seen a solution as easy to install and configure. We'll come onto this a little bit more later in the presentation, but when we say that all we need is a dedicated virtual machine or an Attivo appliance on premise and a read-only domain account, we're not joking. You can get this from arriving on a customer network with a VM ready. You can have a complete assessment of their Active Directory done within a day, probably within half a day, but allowing for slowdowns and lunch breaks and those kinds of things. The way that this works is this VM on the left-hand side doesn't need to be, rocket specification. It can be 32 gig of RAM. It can be 4 cores on a medium-sized Active Directory. Transaction number 1 with the arrows here, we pull back a data file from AD, a paged data file, so there is very little impact on the domain controller. And then the processing and the computation happens on the Attivo endpoint. What that then means is you have a full report on all of the static hygiene configuration issues that exist within this environment. And transaction number 2 here is a subscription to the change notification service. All of the changes around password attempts, logins, lockouts are propagated through the domain infrastructure to the primary domain controller, and we can query those and give visibility of real-time attacks on the environment. And this includes a large number of attacks around password hygiene, around the use of deactivated accounts, around the use of default accounts, around spinning up services on domain controllers. There's a huge amount that we can do. But please don't misunderstand me when I say this only takes a day to put in, because it's very often quicker than that. And if you have a desire to run this against customer environments, to run proofs of concept, to run this as a consulting activity, then these are all use cases which not only the licensing model, but the Attivo go-to-market model will support. So let me give you some examples of the things that we look for within AD Assessor. I mean, the real-time detections, there's about 11 of these. I've just given you a small subset number, but if you're seeing DDoS type lockout attempts on the environment. If you're seeing suspicious password changes, you know, I mean, a suspicious password change could be a service account that's not due to have its password changed for another month, and yet all of a sudden it's been changed, or it's been there's been a lockout or an attempt to authenticate, and then it's been changed. There's a number of different conditions that we can produce against the environment to check whether these are suspicious or legitimate activities. The password spray attack, I'm sure you guys will know. To brute force an account, you don't necessarily need to hit it a million times a second with a big rainbow table. You can take a piece of malware, put it on a network, and it can try 1 or 2 passwords a day for all of the environments on the network, and with a high degree of certainty that in a big user community, some of the users will have password 1234 as their password, or winter 12 or something like that. These are passwords which take relatively little time to brute force. And so the password spray attack is a way that an attacker can not fall foul of locking out accounts, but it can still gain valuable visibility into accounts when it can successfully authenticate. Suspicious services on the domain controller. What if you've got a bad guy on your DC already? What if he's spun up a service that is going to talk out to command and control and allow him to get persistence onto that DC? Things like syncs and shadow attacks, but also reactivation of disabled privileged accounts. You know, we've had a guy leave, we deactivated his account, but we can't delete it for obvious reasons, and yet somebody's reactivated this and is trying to use it. These are all conditions that we can detect very, very quickly. And then the hygiene-based detections, or the static detections, we have about 80 of these, and these relate to everything from issues in the password policy, the trusts between the domains, problematic relationships there, delegation issues. We can tell whether you're vulnerable to skeleton key attacks, golden ticket attacks, silver ticket attacks. We can highlight all of the accounts with non-expiring passwords. There's a huge amount that we can do, and all of this is presented into a console, which I will demonstrate to you in a while, but which I will also use to walk you through some of the outputs. So the console itself, you're going to see this, a real demo of this in a second, but you'll see it's nicely organized into panels. There is a prioritized view about the severity of the vulnerabilities that exist on the DC. There are exposures. You can see at the bottom here, you have moving line graphs that talk about how your vulnerabilities are changing over time. We have real-time detection, which I'm going to talk to in a little while as well. And then visibility into the environment itself, how many users we've seen, how many computers, and how many issues exist for some of our top severity detections. You'll also see the red text here, which describes integrations with other components in the Attivo toolset, which I will try to get onto towards the end. So I'm just going to pause for a second. I'm going to ask Renee if there's anything in the chat, but otherwise I think I'm nearly ready to move on to a demonstration. Okay, colleagues, so from that perspective, the thing you're seeing on the screen now is the Attivo Cloud. Now I'm going to put this into light mode, I think, because it's, I think, a little easier to see over WebEx for people in light mode versus dark mode, but you can toggle between the two. In fact, actually, I think that one's better. But what this is a repository for all information around our detection and our assessment products. This can be an on-premise view, this can be a cloud-managed view. But if I go straight into AD Assessor to start with, you'll see the first view that we see on the screen here is this dashboard that I mentioned earlier. And we have a number of very, very key critical visualizations here to show what we've been testing against this domain architecture and what we found. So on the left-hand side here, you have a health metric. This describes the number of passed and failed tests that we've seen. So as I mentioned, we've got about 80 tests that we run. So you can see here 160 tests have been conducted against 2 domains, so 80 per domain. From that perspective, you can see the relationship between these domains here. You can see parent-child, whether there are forest trusts. You can also change the topology view if you have a complicated domain. You can also change to view one or both of the domains by selecting filters here. You can run the analysis manually. This will run a complete assessment of the AD on demand. This can be scheduled, this can run weekly, or it can run every couple of days. And you've obviously then got reports, which I'm going to come into in some detail later. From a configuration perspective, it is very, very straightforward. As I mentioned, all you need is visibility of one of the domain controllers, doesn't need to be the PDC, and a read-only domain account. So we don't need anything funky from an admin or privileged user perspective. We can do this all with read-only credentials. Now, one of the other things that's worth mentioning is that you can get visibility of WinRM related registry keys in your assessments as well. This is another configuration change that you can make. And obviously, if you add our user to the log readers group, you can get much more detailed metrics about services being created on the domain controller. But we'll come on to that in a second. Really, the idea of this screen is it's designed to be a concentrated but usable representation of the metrics we've discovered. So here, for example, we've assessed 2 domains, we've seen a number of users and a number of computers. You'll see at the bottom here, we've got the most vulnerable assessments. So for example, unusual accounts with replication permissions. This would render you vulnerable to a sync attack, where you can pull copies of the Exchange, the AD database down and make changes to it across synchronization. We've got unprivileged users in ACLs here. You know, this is a critical admin SD holder. ACL is a critical way of managing permissions for privileged users across the network. If you have an unprivileged user in that ACL, it's a very, very bad place to be. Weak Kerb TGT account. This is what very, very common. The Kerb TGT account, I'm sure you all know, the Kerberos ticket granting ticket account is something that if is cracked by an attacker, then it can be used to craft golden tickets, really to get the attacker anywhere on the network. This is extremely problematic. It's a very high severity condition. And then hardening recommendations for the DCs. These are just the top 6 of our most high severity assessments that we've seen. If I keep scrolling down, you'll see then that we've got our line graphs here. You can see that the line graphs are superimposed. You have medium and very high overlapping. And any change in these over the days, you know, will show a change in your security posture. These are all flatlined at the moment, but if these lines were to be trending downwards, it would mean you were failing fewer tests and doing better. If they trend upwards, it means that you've got more to worry about. These protection events here relate to our production monitoring solution, AD Secure, which I might get some time to talk about a little later. However, one of the primary things within the solution is then these various severities of tests. Okay, so the low, medium tests are still important and they can still spell trouble within an environment, but the high and the very high severity tests are things that would allow an attacker to gain domain dominance very quickly. And for all of that, you can then see the number of passes and fails against the different severities of test. But what I prefer to do is to drill into the bar itself. So here, the very high severity bar, if I click in there, then this will filter me in just to the very high severity exposures and tests that we've seen. Now, without going into the details of all of these, I want to show you the general layout, because when you understand the general layout, you can make very good use of this product, because you see that we've got our detection names here. You have how they were detected, LDAP, SMB, WinRM. You can see the severity, you can see them when they were last run, and you can see the number of vulnerable domains in our tests for this particular condition. So for example, unprivileged users in the admin SD holder ACL. If you don't know what that means, then you click on details here. And the details will tell you exactly what we're referring to with this particular test. It will tell you how severe the test is. It will even tell you what MITRE think about that test. If I open this link, then you have a hyperlink into MITRE describing the types of conditions that support this particular exposure. So you've got a lot of intelligence built into the product. However, also you've got these mitigation steps here. These are things that you can do to fix this condition. So this is very, very important, because from that perspective, you know, we're not only telling you what it is and how serious it is, we're also telling you what you need to do to fix it. And in the same way, We've got a lot more embedded intelligence in the product here with these references. So the references here often will go out to adsecurity.org, or they will go out to microsoft.com and pull back consolidated and valuable information about why this is important, about what it's related to, about what we're describing in the product. So before we even tell you about the specific accounts or the specific problems, we've told you what this attack means, and we've given you lots and lots of references about how to protect against it and how to fix it. But if I then go into the attack itself here, so unprivileged users in the admin SD holder ACL, if I click on the plus sign here, you will see that for our one vulnerable domain here, I've got two affected user objects in the admin SD holder ACL unprivileged. Now this would be very, very difficult to pull out of a production environment. It's a very, very small configuration within the production environment that would render an attacker a very, very easy path across the network. And so you click on view here, and immediately it will tell you that IDA begins and this service account both have these permissions within the admin SD holder ACL, rendering both of them targets for attackers, because if you compromise this account, you can start playing with privileges for all users across this vulnerability. Now, from that perspective, there's a number of things you can do next. You can fix this. You can go to IDA's account and you can remove her from this list, particularly if she's a regular user. There's no way that she should be there. But maybe there are some conditions, for example, here, where this needs to be in that particular ACL. So you fix IDA, you remove her, but this one you can't do anything about. You need to leave that where it is. You can then specify to exclude the exposure here. What that means is that you are acknowledging things that you can't easily change about your environment. You know about them, you know why they're there, you know what you need to do, but it may be that legacy configurations or issues with the environment mean that you can't make the changes. So you exclude this exposure and it's then excluded from assessment. So you can see your score improve, but you are aware that you still have this outstanding excluded exposure, which you can still report on as well. This doesn't disappear from view completely. It just allows you to move on from this particular exposure, knowing that you've done everything you can to fix it. Then you can rerun the assessment. What this will do is just rerun the tests just for this particular vulnerability. The unprivileged users an admin SD holder ACL is rerun. It will only take a few minutes. A complete assessment on a medium-sized domain will probably take an hour. And on the very large domains, 1 million plus users, it can take potentially 3 or 4 hours to complete. But it's very, very quick. So let me tell you a little bit more about some of these other exposures, because there are a few very interesting ones, and these were really news to me when I started to understand this product. So for example here, the Curb TGT account, rendering a vulnerability to a golden ticket here. So again, we go into the details. This gives us more information about what this means, how an attacker can establish dominance by crafting a golden ticket account. You can specify some behavioral steps in here to minimize the difference there. So let's prevent domain admins from logging on to any other computer than the domain controller. So for example, me, Nick Palmer, I've got my nick.palmer account, and that's the regular account, but my ADM-Nick Palmer account, my domain admin account, really shouldn't be used on anything other than a domain controller. Because if it's in the cache on my memory or on any other machine, it's an extremely high vulnerability if an attacker finds it. So there's some good practical discipline that you can enforce on the domain that way. You reset the Curb TGT account at least every 6 months. This is very important. Knowing also that the Curb TGT account is current -1. In other words, the current password will work, but so will the previous password. So if, having reviewed your security logs using these event IDs, you suspect that you've had a golden ticket attack, then you double reset the password. And here, for example, again with our knowledge base, we go into the knowledge base here, and that talks a little bit more about the practicalities of resetting the password and highlighting the fact that the password history value is 2, the 2 most recent passwords. By resetting this password twice, you clear any old passwords from the history, with complete information on how to actually make these changes and make these resets. So there's a lot in the product from a reference perspective and from a visibility perspective as well. There's just a couple of other things I want to show you from a detection perspective. So if we, for example, go back to our dashboard, and this time we're going to drill into our high severity conditions here. So 23 vulnerable high severity conditions, drilling in there, and there are certain things you know you're always going to see in this list. For example, accounts with non-expiring passwords. Now again, if ever there was a candidate for an exposure to be excluded, it would be this, but there are always going to be ones in this list. For example, in our relatively small test domain, we've got a couple of hundred accounts with non-expiring passwords. So if I view the details here, then you will see all of these non-expiring passwords. There are certain which potentially can't be changed, but then again, Laurie Chapman, Candice Scott, Joe Hall, these are potentially all regular user passwords that could be changed to be expiring. And so from that perspective, you've then got a very clear view, paginated view of all of the things that you need to change and a clear representation of the things you maybe can't change, so that when you rerun this assessment, you'll have excluded the exposure because you've fixed all of the ones you can fix, and the ones that are left you already know about. So from that perspective, this is a really, really nice way to run the checks here. Now, what you can also do is you can then start to pivot on this data. So as you will understand, you know, a user account may be vulnerable for particular classes of vulnerability, but how do you tell if it's appearing in multiple vulnerabilities? Well, what you can do is you can filter by username here. So here's our user Ida Biggins. We know that she's been a problem in the past. If I click apply, I can just filter for the specific things that she's related to. So given that I already acknowledged the access rights on admin SD holder, then she's got a never expiring password and she's got dangerous rights delegation on critical objects. So you can see very, very quickly from these filters here, you can choose exactly the accounts that you want to close in on. The administrator account, for example, default admin account, again, things that you might know about. A weak default admin account, well, what does that mean? Let's have a look here. We'll take a look at the details. There are two conditions associated with this that render it a weak account. And if we have a look at the details here, we've got a password that's been set more than 60 days ago, and we've got non-expiring UAC on this account. So there's a lot of policies and a lot of specifics that we are highlighting in this particular environment, a lot of detail that we can give you about particular accounts. And once you've set filters, you can just very, very quickly just drop them from this view here and get you straight back out again. Now, there are two other things I want to show you quickly, and then just a couple more slides before we finish, and that is the reporting here. So the reporting itself has been designed to be extremely portable and extremely easy to use. So for example, if I open up my scheduled reports here, you'll see I've got a PDF that's been generated for each of the domains that we've run assessments on. You can also see that there is a supporting folder named after each domain that describes all of the content, all of the problematic accounts, all of the connection issues, all of the vulnerability assessments that we've run in CSV format here for distribution to the people that can fix them. Now, from that perspective, one of the plus sides of this kind of level of visibility is it tells you everything that's wrong with your domain. One of the downsides is it tells you everything that's wrong with your domain. And so from that perspective, it's worth keeping this kind of data on a very need to know basis, you know, so you wouldn't necessarily distribute all this information and store it somewhere centrally, because it tells an attacker everything that they need to know about your domain and how to exploit it. But what you can do is you can trim these reports down, you can send them to particular people, so that when you do drill into one of these reports here, then you get a full report based on what we've discussed and what we've discovered. You get a fully paginated contents list with all of the conditions that we've assessed, all 80 of them, I think, in here. Yep. But also then you get an executive summary showing the health of the environment, the severity of the vulnerabilities, whether we've got mappings to the MITRE framework, the most vulnerable assessmentation of the tests we've been running. So here you can see a small increase in the number of failed high severity tests. This means we are a little worse off than we were before. Something has happened here, which has meant we failed a test, whereas before we didn't. So this is a way you can chart your progress against improvement programs within Active Directory as well. And from an exclusions perspective, these are all of the things, for example, as I mentioned before, accounts with non-expiring passwords, where if you've changed everything that you can, what you're left with are the things that you can't change, so that you can exclude them from reporting, but you still have a reminder here that they are excluded. And if we scroll down a little further, you will then get all of the detail associated with each of the detections. So for example here, the print spooler, print nightmare vulnerability, you can identify the vulnerable domains. Everything that you see in the web interface is available in text format within the report. So, you know, what this means, how severe might I think it is, what the mitigation steps are, sometimes quite detailed, to talk about patching and removing the vulnerability for print nightmare. And then at the bottom, the affected objects and hyperlinks into the knowledge base articles that tell you more about this vulnerability. So I think you'll agree this is an extremely sophisticated reporting engine, and it can be customized so that you're consuming only the data that you think your admins need to use. So for example, you could just choose, for example, filter by exclusion name here, detection name, and you could just choose accounts with never expiring passwords, skeleton key vulnerability assessment. You run that test, and then when you trigger reports on this, or you trigger download reports on this, what that will do is it will create you a report just with those two conditions. So you don't need to distribute a PDF widely with everything that's wrong with your network. You can choose the parts that you're gonna separate. This is also a fully role-based access console. You can give people limited or full access to the console to consume the data that way as well. So one last thing I wanted to show you within the console itself is the real-time attack detections. Now this is very, very interesting because here you see an AD assessor. We've got a set of real-time detections here. Now these are sample ones, but they are extremely useful, extremely interesting, because if we look at the first one, or the last one here, suspicious service creation on domain controller execution. This could be an extremely severe position for an organization to be in, because what it would mean is that an attacker had got onto the domain controller and had launched a non-whitelisted or a suspicious process. So if I go into the details view on this particular detection here, you'll see that we are again highlighting the MITRE detection. You're getting a summary of exactly what's been described here, and you're getting a view option, which will tell you the event ID, when it was generated, the name of the service that's been created on the DC, and exactly where it was put, and the account under which it was run. So very, very quickly highlight and identify irregular or downright dangerous activities on the domain controller that could be evidence of either a compromise or could be useful for an attacker seeking to execute a compromise. And in the same way, let's take a look at the password spray one here. This is always interesting. So the password spray credential access, as I mentioned, this could be malware on a network, and it's not firing, you know, 10,000 password attempts into a single account per second. It's firing a single password attempt into 10,000 attempts, 10,000 accounts every hour, every couple of hours. So it's not falling foul of the lockout policy, but it's allowing the malware to gather reconnaissance about what the passwords might be on those machines. And as soon as it stumbles something in the rainbow table, you know, the password 1234 or the admin combination, then it will log it, and you've effectively got a compromise. So if we take a look at the details for this one, what you can do is take a look at the details for any of these particular conditions. Again, you've got the MITRE mapping, you've got the credential access, but if you go into the view details here, what this is showing you is on a particular domain here, there's IDA again, you know, you have particular accounts that have had 12 attempts on their password in the last few days, set against the last successful login time of 15 days ago. So somebody's been trying to get into all of these accounts with a number of different password attempts, and really the greater the distance between the last successful login and the last bad password attempt, really this is a higher severity condition, because you know, you wouldn't try to log into an account 12 times and not successfully log in if you were a real user. This is evidence of very, very serious attacker behavior. And what you can do then ultimately is you can then geolocate or triangulate back to the source machine that's been making these changes. Just imagine if all of these password attempts came from the same machine, the same workstation. That would very clearly be a compromised endpoint, and it's one that would be very, very difficult to detect and to find without this kind of automation to run it. So again, I'm going to pause for a couple of sessions, just for a couple of seconds, while we check the chat for questions. Before then I go back to the PowerPoint for just a couple more slides. Okay, colleagues, so the last, sorry, Renee, did you have a question?
Oh no, I'll save it for the end, thank you.
Okay, sure. So really, you know, the AD protection with the corresponding risk reduction is very much a life cycle perspective, because Active Directory assessment of the type that we've discussed today is not everything that we do. You know, you have the AD assessment capabilities and the live attack detection capabilities, but moving further into production, you know, once you've hardened Active Directory and once you're checking for real-time attacks on Active Directory, what else can you do? And from that perspective, within the Attivo solution set, there are capabilities, for example, to understand the normal rhythms of AD chatter within an organization and highlight irregularities, highlight where there are credentials exposed on workstations, highlight where there are workstations that are querying Active Directory using unsigned processes, highlight where there are workstations that there are compromised processes that are performing queries against Active Directory. And so by hardening it pre-production and then moving through to visibility and detection in production, and then finally getting into the wider platform, the wider Attivo platform is much more about defense and detection against multi-platform, multi-system, multi-infrastructure environments. This can be everything from cloud through SCADA systems and even on-premise. This integrated platform that borrows from the hardening done with AD Assessor earlier in the life cycle, protects Active Directory from reconnaissance, and then still provides detection of attackers who have managed to compromise visibility of the systems. So this last one, just as really as a summary slide, when we talk about AD Assessor, we're talking about continuous pen testing for Active Directory, real-time visibility, live attack detection, and complete visibility of exposures, as you've seen in the pane of glass. Now, what this means is that you get the outputs, you get fully exportable, fully customizable outputs. When you can't remediate, you get mitigation options, and you can know that you've resolved some of these issues with true confidence. It's extremely easy to install. If I didn't say this clearly enough at the beginning, you know, give us a VM on your network and we will give you a full assessment of even the biggest domain within 24 hours. It's extremely easy to do. And then what that then means is that you can then take these results and ultimately these will segue down onto some very obvious and very, very easily predictable conditions. But very often there is an awful lot more than that. So, you know, these are the common detections that we have: non-expiring passwords, weak default accounts, dangerous delegations, but we see an awful lot more. And sometimes we see real password spray attacks, we see real mass account lockouts, we see real suspicious changes. We even see business email compromise early indicators as the attributes of users in Active Directory are changed to allow them to send emails on behalf of other aliases. And the thing is that this is the final point, really. There are no elevated privileges. There's nothing that you need to deploy onto the domain controllers. This is a VM on-premise that has visibility of the DCs and that has a read-only domain account. And when we have that, everything else will happen automatically. So let me thank you for your attention today, colleagues. Renee, I think that it sounds like there were some questions. So if we have a few minutes, which I think we do, I'm very happy to take them now.
Yes. Let's see. How can you exclude normal users' behavior from the detections?
So normal user behavior from the detections. So there are the detections themselves are vulnerabilities within Active Directory. So these really are not normal user activity at all. You know, normal user activity, we are used to whitelisting with our detection capabilities, but from the perspective of an assessment, what we are expecting to see here is always things that we can fix. Now, if you have real users with rights and privileges that you can't change, then that's how we do those exceptions that we described. You can exclude those things from evaluation, and you can then rerun the tests, knowing that you fixed everything that you can.
All right, clear.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just have one more, I think. Do you support OT environments like SCADA?
Yes, we do. Absolutely, yes. So particularly from a detection perspective, we can put down decoy systems on SCADA networks to elicit attacker activity and to understand what attackers might be doing in those environments. And if there are SCADA-related entries in Active Directory, we can query those and show vulnerabilities around those as well.
All right. Very clear. Also, thank you. I think that was all, unless anyone of the attendees have a question popping up. I think not. All right. Well, then, thank you very much, Nick, for your explanation and for your time, everyone who has attended. And yeah, let's keep in contact.